The rain poured relentlessly, creating a melancholic symphony against the aged windows of the old hospital. Its once pristine white walls now bore the stains of time, creeping vines and moss adding an eerie touch to the abandoned structure. The hospital had been closed for over a decade, its corridors echoing with the memories of countless patients and the tireless staff who once walked its halls. Rumors had long circulated about strange occurrences within its walls, tales of ghostly apparitions and unexplained noises. It was this reputation that drew 4 individuals to its doors on a stormy night: Haruki, a curious journalist Yumi, a brave photographer Takashi, a skeptical doctor, and Mika, a local with a personal connection to the hospital. Haruki had heard whispers of the phantom rounds, a spectral figure said to roam the hospital's corridors at night, mimicking the routines of the nurses and doctors of the past. Intrigued by the possibility of uncovering a story that could make headlines, he convinced his friends to join him in exploring the haunted hospital. As they stepped inside, the air grew colder, the musty scent of decay and mold assaulting their senses. The flickering beam of Haruki's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the peeling wallpaper and broken tiles of the once bustling facility. "Let's split up and cover more ground," Haruki suggested, his voice barely a whisper. Yumi nodded, her camera at the ready, while Takashi scoffed, clearly unconvinced by the tales of ghosts. Mika, however, looked uneasy, her eyes darting nervously around the shadowy hallway. Haruki and Yumi headed towards the old wards, while Takashi and Mika took the opposite direction, exploring the administrative offices and the operating theaters. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant rumble of thunder. Haruki and Yumi found themselves in what appeared to be the children's ward. Faded murals of smiling animals and cheerful scenes now barely visible on the walls. Yumi snapped photos, capturing the haunting beauty of the decayed room. Suddenly, a faint sound reached their ears, a distant echo of footsteps. Haruki signaled for Yumi to stay quiet, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct, and unmistakably human. They followed the sound, their hearts pounding in their chests. Turning a corner, they found themselves face to face with a figure in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, its face obscured by shadows. The figure moved with a mechanical precision, as if stuck in a loop, performing tasks from a long-forgotten routine. Haruki felt a chill run down his spine as he watched the spectral nurse. He pulled out his notebook, scribbling down details, while Yumi captured the scene with her camera. The nurse's movements were eerie, almost robotic, and it soon became clear that this was no ordinary apparition. Meanwhile, Takashi and Mika made their way through the operating theaters, the cold steel of the surgical tables glinting in the dim light. Takashi's skepticism began to waver as they heard whispers, faint and unintelligible, as if the walls themselves were speaking. Mika clutched his arm, her fear palpable. "Takashi, I don't like this. We should leave," she pleaded. But Takashi was determined to find a rational explanation for the strange occurrences. They continued exploring, the whispers growing louder and more distinct until they reached the morgue. The air was icy, their breaths visible in the cold. Drawn by a strange compulsion, Takashi opened one of the morgue drawers, revealing a decayed body, its features twisted in an expression of terror. Mika screamed, the sound echoing through the empty halls, and they fled the room, their footsteps pounding in the silence. Back in the children's ward, Haruki and Yumi continued to follow the spectral nurse, who seemed oblivious to their presence. Suddenly, the nurse stopped, turning slowly to face them. For a moment, they saw its eyes empty, hollow sockets that seemed to bore into their souls. A cold wind swept through the ward, extinguishing their flashlights and plunging them into darkness. Panic set in as they fumbled for their lights, the oppressive silence only broken by their ragged breaths. When they finally managed to turn their flashlights back on, the nurse was gone, leaving them alone in the empty ward. They hurried back to the entrance, eager to regroup with Takashi and Mika and share their experiences. As they reached the lobby, they found their friends waiting, their faces pale and haunted. "Did you see it?" Haruki asked, breathless. Takashi nodded, his earlier skepticism replaced by a grim resolve. "We need to leave now," he said, his voice shaky. But as they turned to exit, the heavy doors slammed shut with a deafening bang, locking them inside. Panic turned to terror as they realized they were trapped. The haunted hospital now their prison. The sound of footsteps echoed once more through the halls, growing louder, closer. "The phantom rounds," Haruki whispered, his voice trembling. The ghostly nurse had returned, and this time it was not alone. Figures emerged from the shadows. Spectral doctors and nurses, their hollow eyes fixed on the intruders. The air grew colder, the sense of dread overwhelming. With nowhere to run, they could only watch in horror as the phantoms closed in, their fates sealed within the haunted hospital's cursed walls. The sound of footsteps echoed through the desolate halls, growing louder and more distinct with each passing second. Haruki, Yumi, Takashi, and Mika stood frozen, their breaths shallow as the spectral doctors and nurses emerged from the shadows. The oppressive silence was shattered by the whispers of the phantoms, their hollow eyes fixed on the intruders. "We need to find a way out," Haruki said, his voice barely a whisper. Yumi nodded, gripping her camera tightly. While Takashi and Mika exchanged worried glances, they moved cautiously, the air thick with tension as they navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the hospital. The walls seemed to close in around them, the oppressive darkness making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Haruki led the way, his flashlight casting eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper. They reached a stairwell, the rusted metal steps creaking under their weight as they descended to the lower floors. The air grew colder, the musty scent of decay growing stronger as they ventured deeper into the hospital's bowels. They reached the basement, the dim light revealing rows of old filing cabinets and storage rooms filled with forgotten medical equipment. Haruki rummaged through the cabinets, hoping to find something that could explain the hospital's haunting. Yumi and Mika stood guard, their eyes darting nervously around the room, while Takashi examined a set of old patient records, the yellowed pages brittle under his fingers. He found a file labeled "Special Cases" and began to read, his eyes widening as he uncovered the dark secrets of the hospital. It seemed that the hospital had been conducting unethical experiments on its patients, using them as test subjects for dangerous and unapproved treatments. Many of the patients had died as a result of these experiments, their bodies hidden away in the morgue to cover up the hospital's crimes. Takashi shared his findings with the others, their expressions turning grim as the gravity of the situation sank in. "We need to find the evidence and get out of here," Haruki said, determination replacing his earlier fear. They continued their search, moving through the basement with renewed urgency. As they approached the old operating theaters, the whispers grew louder, the spectral figures of doctors and nurses appearing once more. This time, however, they seemed less hostile, their hollow eyes filled with a haunting sadness. Haruki realized that the phantoms were not trying to harm them, but to communicate. "They want us to know the truth," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and fear. Yumi snapped photos of the phantoms, capturing their mournful expressions, while Mika and Takashi continued to search for evidence. They found a hidden door at the back of one of the operating theaters, leading to a small, dimly lit room. Inside, they discovered a cache of documents detailing the hospital's experiments, along with photographs of the victims. The sight was horrifying, the images of emaciated patients and twisted corpses, filling them with a deep sense of dread. They gathered the documents, their minds racing as they tried to piece together the hospital's dark history. As they prepared to leave, the spectral figures began to fade, their whispers growing fainter. The air grew colder once more, the sense of dread intensifying as they realized they were not alone. A shadowy figure appeared at the far end of the room, its form indistinct and shifting. The figure moved closer, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of malice. Haruki and the others backed away, their hearts pounding in their chests. The figure's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, its face twisted in an expression of pure hatred. "You should not have come here," it hissed, its voice echoing through the room. Haruki realized with a jolt of terror that this was the spirit of the doctor who had conducted the experiments. Driven mad by guilt and rage, his spirit had been trapped in the hospital, tormenting anyone who dared to uncover his secrets. The room grew colder, the walls seeming to close in around them as the spirit advanced. Haruki and the others fled, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls as they raced towards the exit. The spirit pursued them, its malevolent presence growing stronger with each passing second. They reached the stairwell, the rusted steps groaning under their weight as they climbed towards the upper floors. The spirit's voice echoed through the halls, a cacophony of anger and despair that seemed to pierce their very souls. "There's no way out," Mika cried, her voice filled with panic. Haruki refused to give up, his determination driving him forward. "We have to keep going," he said, his voice firm despite the terror that gripped him. They reached the ground floor, the heavy doors still locked and barred. Desperation set in as they searched for another way out, their minds racing with fear and adrenaline. Takashi spotted a window at the far end of the corridor, its glass cracked and dusty. "We can break the window and escape," he said, his voice filled with a glimmer of hope. They rushed towards the window, using a nearby chair to shatter the glass. The cold night air rushed in, a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere inside the hospital. One by one, they climbed through the window, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they tasted freedom. They stood outside the hospital, the rain pouring down around them, their bodies trembling with a mixture of fear and relief. Haruki turned to look at the building, its dark silhouette looming ominously against the stormy sky. "We have the evidence," he said, his voice resolute. "We can expose the truth and put an end to this nightmare." Yumi nodded, her camera still clutched tightly in her hands. While Mika and Takashi exchanged relieved smiles, they knew that their ordeal was far from over, but they had survived the night in the haunted hospital. As they walked away, the hospital's windows seemed to glow with a faint, eerie light, the spirits within watching them leave. The phantom rounds had revealed their secrets, and now it was up to Haruki and his friends to ensure that the truth was known. The rain had finally subsided, leaving a damp, eerie stillness in its wake. Haruki, Yumi, Takashi, and Mika stood outside the hospital, their clothes soaked and their breaths visible in the cold night air. The documents and photographs they had gathered were now safely stashed in Haruki's waterproof bag, each piece of evidence a chilling testament to the hospital's dark past. "We need to get these to the authorities," Haruki said, breaking the silence. His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed the fear that still lingered from their harrowing escape. Yumi nodded, her camera hanging heavily around her neck. Mika and Takashi exchanged worried glances, their faces pale and haunted. The group made their way to the nearest police station, their footsteps echoing in the deserted streets. As they walked, Haruki couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, the spectral presence of the hospital's spirits still looming over them. Upon arriving at the police station, they were met with skepticism. The officers listened to their story with raised eyebrows, glancing at each other in disbelief. But when Haruki produced the documents and Yumi showed the photographs, the atmosphere shifted. The evidence was irrefutable, and the officers' expressions turned grim. "This is serious," one of them muttered, flipping through the files. "We'll need to investigate this further." They were advised to stay in town for the time being, in case the authorities needed more information. Reluctantly, they agreed, checking into a nearby inn to rest and regroup. The inn was old, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of history. Haruki lay on the tatami mat, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with the events of the night. Yumi sat by the window, editing her photographs, While Mika and Takashi tried to sleep, their restless movements betraying their unease. As dawn broke, a knock on the door startled them. Haruki opened it to find a middle-aged man standing there, his face lined with worry. "My name is Hiroshi," he introduced himself. "I'm a local historian. I heard about your discovery at the hospital." Haruki invited him in, and they gathered around the low table. As Hiroshi began to speak, "The hospital's history is a dark one," Hiroshi explained, his voice somber. "It was built during the Taisho era, originally intended as a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients, but over the years, it became a place of horror." He went on to recount tales of unethical experiments conducted by a doctor named Ishida, driven by a desire to find a cure for the diseases that plagued his patients. Ishida had crossed every line, using them as guinea pigs for his twisted experiments. Many of the patients had died, their spirits trapped within the hospital's walls. The locals knew something was wrong, Hiroshi continued, but they were too afraid to speak out. The hospital was eventually shut down, but the spirits of the victims remained, seeking justice. The group listened in stunned silence, the weight of the hospital's cursed legacy settling heavily on their shoulders. "We need to find a way to put their spirits to rest," Haruki said, determination in his eyes. Yumi, Takashi, and Mika nodded in agreement, their fear replaced by a sense of purpose. Hiroshi suggested they visit the local shrine, where the head priest might be able to help. The shrine was nestled in the forest, its torii gate standing tall against the backdrop of ancient trees. They were greeted by the head priest, an elderly man with kind eyes and a serene demeanor. Haruki explained their situation, showing him the documents and photographs. The priest listened intently, his expression growing grave. "The spirits of the hospital's victims are restless," he said, his voice soft but firm. "They seek justice for the wrongs done to them. To put them to rest, we must perform a ritual to cleanse the hospital of its dark energy." He instructed them to gather specific items for the ritual: a piece of the hospital's original foundation, a personal belonging of one of the victims, and a photograph of the hospital taken before it was abandoned. With Hiroshi's help, they managed to locate the items, each one a poignant reminder of the hospital's tragic past. The piece of the foundation was taken from a crumbling corner of the building, its cold, rough surface a testament to the passage of time. The personal belonging was a locket found in the basement among the documents. Its delicate chain rusted and its glass cover cracked. The photograph was discovered in an old newspaper archive, showing the hospital in its early days, a beacon of hope before it became a place of nightmares. With the items in hand, they returned to the shrine, where the priest prepared for the ritual. He instructed them to hold the items and focus on their intent. Channeling their energy into the ritual, the priest began to chant, his voice rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence that seemed to resonate with the very air around them. As the ritual progressed, the atmosphere grew charged with energy, the weight of the hospital's dark history pressing down on them. Haruki could feel the spirit's presence, their longing for justice and peace. The ritual reached its climax, the priest's voice growing louder, more insistent. A blinding light enveloped them, and Haruki felt a rush of emotions: fear, anger, sorrow, and finally, a profound sense of release. When the light faded, the air felt lighter. The oppressive weight of the hospital's spirits lifted. The priest looked at them, his eyes filled with a gentle wisdom. "The spirits have found peace," he said softly. "They are no longer bound to the hospital." Haruki, Yumi, Takashi, and Mika breathed a collective sigh of relief, the tension that had gripped them finally easing. They thanked the priest and Hiroshi for their help, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. As they left the shrine, the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the landscape. They knew their journey wasn't over. They still had to ensure that the hospital's dark history was exposed, that the victims' stories were told. But for now, they felt a sense of closure, knowing that they had helped put the spirits to rest. Back at the inn, They gathered around the table, sharing a meal and reflecting on their experiences. The horrors they had faced had forged a bond between them, a shared determination to seek justice and truth. Haruki looked at his friends, feeling a sense of pride and gratitude. "We did it," he said, his voice filled with quiet satisfaction. "We helped them find peace." Yumi smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. "Yes, we did, and we'll make sure their story is heard." Mika and Takashi nodded, their expressions resolute. As they sat together, the weight of their ordeal lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose and hope. They knew there were still challenges ahead, but they were ready to face them, united by their shared experience and determination. The spirits of the hospital had found peace, and now it was time to ensure that their story was told, that the darkness of the past would never be forgotten. With renewed strength and a sense of mission, they prepared for the next steps in their journey, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The hospital's dark secrets had been revealed, and the path to justice and truth was clear. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the landscape as Haruki, Yumi, Takashi, and Mika walked back to the hospital. Their footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path, the air filled with a sense of foreboding. They had returned to ensure that the evidence they uncovered would see the light of day. As they approached the hospital, its dark silhouette loomed against the night sky, the memories of their previous encounter sending shivers down their spines. Determined to end this once and for all, they crossed the threshold, their flashlights piercing the inky darkness. The air inside was cold and heavy, the scent of decay and mold stronger than before. Their footsteps echoed through the empty halls, each creak and groan of the old building amplifying their anxiety. Haruki led the way, his flashlight illuminating the path ahead, while Yumi, Takashi, and Mika followed closely behind. They reached the basement, the place where they had discovered the hospital's dark secrets. The documents and photographs they had taken to the authorities had been returned to them, deemed insufficient evidence without further investigation. Haruki knew they needed something more concrete, something undeniable. In the dim light, they scoured the basement once more, hoping to find additional evidence. As they searched, the air grew colder, the oppressive atmosphere thickening around them. Mika gasped as she uncovered a hidden compartment behind a stack of old filing cabinets. Inside, they found more documents, even more damning than the first set. These detailed the horrific experiments in gruesome detail, including names and dates that matched the hospital's records. As they gathered the new evidence, a faint whispering filled the room, the voices of the spirits growing louder and more distinct. Haruki felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the spirits were trying to communicate. "We have to finish this," he said, his voice trembling but determined. With the new evidence in hand, they made their way back to the ground floor, the whispers growing louder with each step. The oppressive feeling intensified, the air thick with the presence of the spirits. Suddenly, the spectral figure of Dr. Ishida appeared before them, his hollow eyes filled with rage. "You should not have come back," he hissed, his voice echoing through the empty halls. Haruki and the others stood their ground, the weight of their mission giving them strength. "We're here to make sure the truth is known," Haruki said, his voice steady, despite the fear that gripped him. Dr. Ishida's form flickered, his rage palpable. The air grew colder, the lights flickering as the spirits of the victims began to manifest around them. The room filled with their anguished cries, their hollow eyes, pleading for justice. Takashi stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We know what you did. We're going to make sure the world knows too." Dr. Ishida's form wavered, his rage giving way to a twisted expression of fear. The spirits of the victims closed in, their presence growing stronger. Haruki and the others could feel the weight of their suffering, the pain and horror they had endured. With a final, desperate scream, Dr. Ishida's form dissipated, the spirits of the victims finally free to move on. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, the air growing warmer as the spirits found peace. Haruki, Yumi, Takashi, and Mika stood in stunned silence, the weight of their ordeal lifting as the spirits departed. They knew their mission wasn't over. They still had to ensure that the evidence they had gathered was made public. With renewed determination, they left the hospital, their steps lighter as they made their way back to the police station. This time, the officers took their evidence seriously. The detailed documents and photographs leaving no room for doubt. An investigation was launched, and the dark history of the hospital was finally brought to light. The story made headlines, the horrors of Dr. Ishida's experiments shocking the nation. Haruki, Yumi, Takashi, and Mika became local heroes, their bravery and determination ensuring that justice was served. The hospital was demolished, the site cleansed and transformed into a memorial for the victims. The spirits had found peace, and the darkness that had plagued the hospital was finally banished. As they stood before the memorial, Haruki felt a sense of closure, the weight of their ordeal lifting as they remembered the spirits they had helped. "We did it," he said, softly, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and sadness. Yumi, Takashi, and Mika nodded, their expressions reflecting the same mix of emotions. They had faced their fears, uncovered the truth, and ensured that justice was served. The hospital's dark legacy had been revealed, and the spirits of the victims had finally found peace. As they walked away from the memorial, the sun began to rise, casting a golden light over the landscape. The future lay ahead, filled with hope and the promise of new beginnings. Haruki looked at his friends, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and pride. They had faced the darkness together and emerged stronger for it. And as they moved forward, they knew that the spirits of the hospital would always be with them. A reminder of the courage and determination it took to uncover the truth and bring justice to the forgotten.